Melissa grew up in a small suburban neighborhood where her beauty was often the focus of attention. From a young age, she learned that charm could open doors, a lesson reinforced by her mother, who emphasized the power of appearances. Despite this, Melissa dreamed of a career in fashion design, inspired by the glossy magazines that adorned her room. During her first year at university, Melissa was outgoing and ambitious. She quickly befriended a circle of women who shared her interest in social climbing, though their motives often seemed superficial. One of her closest allies was Danielle, who became both a confidant and a rival in their shared pursuit of success and influence. In her junior year, Melissa met Ryan at a campus party. His charisma and confidence drew her in immediately, and their whirlwind romance consumed her. Ryan's betrayal, a public and humiliating affair, left her shattered and distrustful, fueling a resolve never to be vulnerable again. Melissa encountered Darren during the summer after Ryan's betrayal. His calm demeanor and sincere interest stood in stark contrast to the flashy personas she had previously been drawn to. Encouraged by her friends, she decided to give him a chance, though she was determined to maintain control in their budding relationship. By the time they married, Melissa had crafted a dynamic that suited her need for control. Darren, eager to please, bent to her preferences from the house they purchased to the friends they entertained. While Darren found satisfaction in making her happy, Melissa's insecurities often manifested as strict boundaries and occasional harshness. Years into their marriage, Melissa began to notice changes in Darren. Once entirely focused on her, he developed new hobbies and friendships. While she dismissed these initially, her growing discomfort hinted at an underlying fear that her grip on their relationship was slipping. This unease set the stage for the conflicts that would soon unfold. Darren's voice snapped sharply, brimming with impatience. "What kept you so long?" Cautiously descending the staircase, Darren clutched her purse in one hand, an unmistakable tension in his movements. With an uneasy expression, he handed it over while Melissa's friends exchanged amused glances, their smirks thinly veiled. Melissa, petite with striking green eyes, gave him a look of barely hidden exasperation. She hadn't changed much since college, still slim with a youthful figure. Her friends except Helen shared a similar knack for staying trim. Helen, however, was a bit heavier, with modest clothing and unbleached dark hair, contrasting with the others' bold short skirts. Darren often wondered why Helen hung out with this group or why they kept her around. She didn't fit in. While the others, especially Melissa, drank freely, Helen abstained. Perhaps she was the designated driver. That seemed the only plausible reason. "Honestly, Darren," Melissa said sharply, "you should be glad I'm leaving. It gives me a break from this place." She gestured to the spacious 4-bedroom house she had insisted they buy 5 years ago. "And it gives you time for your little friends, but don't let them into my house." Without waiting for a reply, she held out her hand. "Now the money." Darren hesitated, then handed over his wallet. She took all the cash without a second thought. Smirking, she added, "If you're lucky, and I'm not too tired when I get back, maybe you'll get lucky, that is, unless I meet someone better." Her laugh rang out, joined by her friends. Except Helen. Darren said nothing as Melissa and her friends piled into the new Honda he bought her weeks earlier. He watched them drive off and went back inside. After tidying up, he loaded his Jeep with tools and auto parts and headed across town to work on a project. In the car, the mood shifted. Helen, silent until now, spoke up. "Melissa, why are you so hard on Darren? He must care about you a lot to put up with this. Don't you love him?" Melissa stayed quiet, but Danielle, another slim blonde, jumped in. "Love doesn't matter. Marriage is about control." Sandra laughed. "Melissa's just keeping control in her marriage. Helen, you still don't get it, do you? The wife makes the rules." Melissa remained lost in thought. She did love Darren in her own way. Over 10 years together, he had always gone out of his way to make her happy, showing unwavering devotion. Yet doubts lingered in her mind. Her thoughts drifted back to college and Ryan, the charismatic guy who had once swept her off her feet during a painful breakup. He had taken her to a romantic dinner, followed by a walk on the beach, where they were close under the stars. He'd promised to call, but days later, she saw him with another girl. The humiliation still stung. She had been just another conquest. Even now, memories of Ryan mixed with her doubts about Darren, leaving her feeling unsettled despite everything he had done for her. Melissa locked herself in her room, crying for days. It took weeks before she returned to class, and she avoided dating for the rest of the semester. During summer break, she stuck to group outings. By fall, her senior year, she still refused to date until she met Darren. Darren was different, kind, respectful, and genuinely interested in her. Her friends encouraged her to give him a chance. Initially, Melissa tested him with challenges she thought he'd never overcome, but Darren proved his dedication every time. Eventually, she agreed to a date, though she warned him not to expect much. Her friends were stunned by her guarded reaction, cautioning that Darren wouldn't wait forever. When he didn't call the next day, Melissa realized she wanted him. Breaking her own rules, she called him, thrilled when he canceled another date to see her. From then on, their dynamic was set. Darren worked tirelessly for her approval while Melissa maintained control. She withheld affection deliberately. No kiss until the 5th date, no real closeness until after their wedding. Even after years of marriage, Melissa dictated the terms of their relationship. Darren never complained, though her behavior left little room for compromise. Recently, however, new friends and hobbies began shifting his perspective. Darren had developed an interest in cars, meeting people through the hobby, including Tim and Elaine Matthews, a couple he admired. After much pleading, Melissa agreed to meet them, curious about their influence on her husband. Tim and Elaine lived in a lovely home with their daughter, Krista. Their relationship surprised Melissa. After a long time of controlling each other, they showed genuine affection. Tim's casual touches and Elaine's warm responses unsettled her. Elaine even kissed him openly in front of guests, something Melissa couldn't fathom. As the evening unfolded, Melissa watched, perplexed. Elaine sat on Tim's lap, unfazed by their company. Meanwhile, Krista wandered into the garage, climbing into Tim's muscle car. Neither parent seemed worried, adding to Melissa's confusion. Then Elaine made an announcement that stunned everyone. She was expecting another child. Tim's joy was obvious, and Melissa noted how quickly the couple shifted focus to their family. Even weeks later, the visit lingered in her mind, challenging her understanding of relationships. Melissa's own marriage contrasted sharply. Though she hadn't been unfaithful to Darren, she liked keeping him unsure, reminding him she could find someone else. But seeing Tim and Elaine's closeness made her question her approach. Unmindfully, she rubbed her stomach, lost in thought. Meanwhile, Darren drove to Tim and Elaine's garage to work on a project. Elaine greeted him warmly, offering to let him start without Tim, who was working late. Darren hesitated but decided to stay, appreciating their kindness. He admired their relationship, longing for similar warmth in his own marriage. Despite his admiration, Melissa dismissed the Matthews as strange, forbidding Darren from inviting them over. She insisted their dynamic had no place in her marriage, ensuring her control remained intact. Yet both Melissa and Darren couldn't ignore the growing gap between them, sparked by the contrasting examples around them. That evening, Melissa and her friends stepped into the packed club, exuding an air of theatrical flair as they claimed a table. It was karaoke night, Melissa's favorite pastime. She relished watching amateurs try to charm the crowd. This club's twist was a live band accompanying the singers, a feature she particularly enjoyed. The first acts were predictably awful but amusing, escaping the stage before the crowd could turn harsh. As the night progressed, the audience grew harsher, mocking the poor performances. Melissa sipped her drink, seated beside a man who had been pursuing her for months. Occasionally, she let him kiss her or touch her chest, despite Darren, but it never went further. Sandra returned to the table with a disheveled man Melissa didn't recognize. Her smeared makeup and his satisfied grin left no doubt about where they had been. "Oh no," Helen muttered. "Relax," Melissa said, rolling her eyes. "Sandra always does this." "Not her," Helen replied, gesturing toward the stage. "Look." Melissa turned her gaze to a tall woman holding the microphone. She had long dark hair like Helen, but was slimmer, with striking features and legs that drew attention. The crowd began booing before she even started. "I didn't know Jessica was coming tonight," Helen murmured, her voice tense. "Who's Jessica?" Melissa asked. "My sister," Helen said flatly, her eyes glued to the stage. Jessica began singing, her powerful, clear voice instantly silencing the room. She captivated the audience, winning over even the loudest hecklers. By the time she finished, the crowd erupted in applause. "Your sister can sing?" Melissa asked, surprised. "Yes," Helen replied, her tone tinged with pride. She tried recording once but couldn't find songs that fit her voice. Music wasn't her passion anyway. It was all for her ex. She's more into cars. Jessica soon joined their table, hugging Helen warmly. Her confident presence turned heads as she surveyed the group. Danielle was perched on a man's lap giggling while Sandra's companion bore lipstick marks matching her own. Melissa batted away the wandering hands of her persistent admirer. Jessica smirked. "Quite the party here," she remarked, her gaze lingering on Melissa briefly. When Melissa returned home, Darren was already asleep, an unusual occurrence. He usually waited up for her either to ensure she wasn't with someone else or to see if she was in the mood. Tonight, he hadn't bothered. Melissa felt a strange unease as she slid into bed, her mind drifting to the Matthews family. For a fleeting moment, she considered stopping her birth control and letting Darren father a child. The idea stirred unexpected vulnerability. Glancing at Darren, peaceful and clutching her pillow, she thought, "Darren, he really must love me." Darren. Tears welled up, but she quickly pushed the feeling aside. Vulnerability wasn't an option. "Darren, why didn't you put the dishes away?" she suddenly shouted, waking him. "Sorry," he mumbled groggily. "I had a late meeting, and I don't want excuses." She snapped, "I want my kitchen clean." Without arguing, Darren got up and went to the kitchen. Melissa watched him go, noticing his strong build. He had woken him partly because she wanted him awake for closeness. She waited in bed, wearing only her bra and undergarments. When Darren returned, he paused in the doorway, his eyes scanning her smudged lipstick and flushed chest. For a moment, she thought she saw desire in his gaze, but he shook his head and left without a word. Melissa was stunned. She expected him to come back, but woke alone the next morning. Darren hadn't returned to their room or said goodbye before leaving for work. Dismissing it, she focused on her day, panicking and working out to stay in shape. After all, she thought, Darren wouldn't want me if I let myself go. At his office, Darren arrived early, his emotions boiling over. After years of enduring Melissa's harshness and indifference, last night had pushed him too far. Convinced she had finally betrayed him, he realized he couldn't take it anymore. Being alone had to be better than living like this. Darren picked up the phone and called Ryan, an old friend and divorce lawyer. Ryan wasn't surprised when Darren explained the situation. "I'm shocked it took you this long," Ryan said. "Handled correctly, we can get you out of this with your dignity intact." "I don't have any proof she's unfaithful," Darren admitted, his voice heavy. "Don't worry about that," Ryan replied. "Forget the cheating angle. Judges don't care anymore. Focus on what matters, or she'll take most of your assets, move her lover in, and humiliate you in your own house. Is that what you want?" Darren clenched his jaw, the scenario Ryan described playing vividly in his mind. "I'll guide you through this," Ryan assured him. "You'll thank me later." With some time before work, Darren sat at his computer, attempting to write a letter to Melissa. He wanted her to understand how deeply she had hurt him. The letter morphed into a poem, raw with emotion. It wasn't perfect, but it was the truth. His pain and longing spilled onto the page, yet something felt incomplete. So he set it aside and focused on work instead. When Darren returned home that evening, Melissa was already sprawled on the sofa in a short skirt, her legs provocatively positioned. Darren barely glanced at her, his thoughts clouded with suspicion that she had spent the afternoon with someone else. Bitterly, he almost hoped Ryan's surveillance would catch her in the act. Ignoring her, he went to his office to research car paint options. Melissa, frustrated, had been waiting for his attention all day. Her plan was for him to notice her and practically beg for closeness, but his indifferent glance felt like a slap. Darren? What's wrong with him? Melissa wondered. Instead of desire, his expressions seemed tinged with sadness or resentment. Darren, she screamed. When did you get home? Why isn't dinner ready? He didn't respond. Furious, she stormed to his locked office door, kicked it, and then left the house to vent to Danielle. But Danielle's laughter only irritated her more. When Helen arrived, Melissa recounted the story again. Danielle dismissed Darren's behavior, claiming Melissa needed to solidify her control and push him to accept her terms unconditionally. Helen, however, was blunt. Danielle, your marriage failed because of your obsession with control. Stop projecting your misery onto Melissa. Danielle protested, but Helen cut her off, recounting how Danielle's husband left her after catching her flirting. He had since remarried and built a happy life. While Danielle's bitterness consumed her, Helen then turned to Melissa. Melissa, she said gently, marriage isn't a battle, it's a partnership. Look at couples like Tim and Elaine. They're equals. They love each other deeply because they work together, not against each other. Melissa thought of Tim and Elaine, their easy affection and genuine love. She realized she didn't know how to bridge the gap in her own marriage, or even where to begin. Ease up on Darren, Helen advised. Stop trying to control everything. If you don't, you'll lose him just like Danielle lost her husband, and you'll end up alone and bitter too. Melissa sat silently, Helen's words weighing heavily on her. For the first time, she wondered if it was time to change. Their conversation was interrupted by the doorbell. Darren emerged from his office just as Melissa went to answer it. Hey, Darren, Helen said warmly. How's it going? Not great, he replied, sounding defeated. I can't find anyone to paint my car. Helen noticed his downcast mood and sensed the issue ran deeper than a car. She quickly jotted down a number on a notepad. Her name is Jessica, she said, handing it to him. Tell her I sent you. She'll take care of you. Thanks, Darren, he said, his voice subdued. Helen added gently, Darren, you're a good guy. It's okay to stand up for yourself sometimes. You don't always have to give in. Melissa returned, noticing their conversation. We need to go, she told Helen curtly. Danielle has some emergency. Helen raised an eyebrow. I'm going home. Screw Danielle and her drama. She told me to get my things out of her house. I see no reason to go back. Later, Melissa arrived at Danielle's house to find her lying on the couch with a compress on her head, looking miserable. Sandra was there but quickly made her exit, muttering about a date. Where's Helen? Danielle groaned. Melissa raised an eyebrow. Remember when you told her to leave your house? That's not what I meant, Danielle snapped. Sandra chimed in. Her ex's new wife is expecting again, and he named the baby after Danielle's mom. Now her mom's the godmother, and rubbing it in her face. That's why she's upset. Melissa spent the evening listening to Danielle rant about her ex-husband, who had moved on and built a happy life. Danielle lamented not having control over him that Melissa seemed to have over Darren. As Melissa listened, her resentment toward Darren simmered, and she decided he needed to pay for not giving in to her the previous night. Meanwhile, Darren reviewed recordings from the house. They mostly captured Melissa yelling at him, but Helen's words about standing up for himself stuck with him. Encouraged, he called the number Helen had given him. Jessica invited him to her garage to discuss the car paint. At the garage, Jessica greeted Darren warmly and gave him a tour. showing him the paint booth and her past projects. One photo caught his eye, a Mustang with a custom purple paint job that belonged to Tim. Darren asked if she could replicate the color with white stripes, and Jessica agreed enthusiastically. Their conversation flowed easily, revealing shared interests beyond the car. The faint sound of guitar music drifted through the garage. Jessica smiled. "Sorry, I invited some friends for a jam session." Darren smiled back. "I enjoyed talking to you, not just about the car." Jessica's expression shifted when Darren mentioned Melissa, her pity evident. It's a shame Alyssa treated him so poorly when he was clearly a good man. "What?" Darren asked, noticing her reaction. "Nothing," Jessica said quickly. "We're trying to write something tonight. None of us are great songwriters, but we love playing." "Mind if I stay and listen?" Darren asked. "Of course," Jessica said, smiling. The evening had an almost magical feel. Jessica sang a few familiar songs in the group, attempted original material, but something always felt off. As the night wound down, Jessica joked that they were probably just a cover band. "I don't know," Darren said. "You just need the right song." Jessica shrugged. "People have been saying that for years. Music's more of a hobby. I'd do it for my friends. If I didn't, they'd replace me and life would go on." "You're really good, though," Darren insisted. Jessica hesitated. "Want something to eat?" "Oh, wait, you're married." "Not for much longer," Darren admitted. "My lawyer is working on the divorce papers." Jessica paused. "So you already know?" Darren asked. Jessica smiled faintly. "I stay neutral. I don't meddle in other people's matters." "This isn't a war," Darren replied. "A war takes two sides fighting. This is more like a rebellion, my act of emancipation." Jessica looked at him, curious. "Don't take my word for it," Darren added. "Ask your sister about my marriage to Melissa. She knows it's always been Melissa's way or no way." The last few days just confirmed what I should have realized years ago. Darren and Jessica spent hours talking, sharing stories about their failed marriages. Jessica confided that her ex-husband, despite having a beautiful wife, couldn't resist his fans' attention. Darren felt a connection he hadn't felt in years. When Darren finally returned home near midnight, Melissa was on the couch in a nearly transparent nightgown, clearly meant to provoke him. "Where the hell have you been?" she demanded. "I was checking on my car's paint job," Darren replied calmly. "I got caught up talking." "If it matters, I'm sorry. You should have been here waiting for me," she snapped. "How was I supposed to know that?" he asked, his frustration evident. "You never told me. You should have known," she shot back. Darren sighed and went upstairs, moving his clothes into the guest room. Melissa followed, yelling at him through the locked door, but he ignored her, jotting down words that poured out of him. The next day at work, he refined the poem, adding stanzas and a chorus, envisioning a melody and guitar riff. Later, his secretary interrupted, saying Melissa was on the phone. Darren told her to take a message, shocking her. He never ignored Melissa's calls. Minutes later, Darren called Jessica instead. "Hey, how much will the paint job cost?" he asked. "You cover the paint, and I'll do it for free," Jessica offered. "No, I'll pay," Darren insisted. Jessica laughed softly. "I just want to do something nice for you." They arranged for Tim's wife, Elaine, to drop off Darren's car at Jessica's garage. As Jessica thought about Darren calling her Jess, she smiled to herself. She liked it, and him. That evening, Darren came home early, changed quickly, and headed out again. Melissa confronted him. "Where do you think you're going?" she demanded. "I didn't give you permission." "I don't need your permission," Darren said calmly. "You don't tell me where I go, so why should I answer to you?" "What's wrong with you?" Melissa shouted. "For 10 years, you haven't listened to a word I've said," Darren replied firmly. "I loved you, hoping you'd stop punishing me for someone else's mistakes, but maybe it's time I let it go." Stunned, Melissa watched as he walked out. "I'm ready to listen now," she whispered to the empty room. Desperate, she called her friends. Helen suggested Melissa confess her feelings and admit she hadn't been unfaithful. But Danielle had a different idea. Show him you can replace him. Sleep with someone and let him know. You'll regain control. Helen scoffed. If she does that, she'll lose him for good. Back at the fairground, Darren joined Tim and Elaine at a Mustang event. He admired the camaraderie of the enthusiasts and envied the ease and closeness Tim and Elaine shared. As they chatted, Jessica arrived unexpectedly. "Hey, why couldn't I get my surprise today?" she teased, grinning. Tim hugged her enthusiastically, making Jessica laugh. "Well, that was awkward," she joked as he quickly stepped back, embarrassed. "Sorry," Tim muttered, smiling sheepishly. Darren watched the exchange, struck by Jessica's warmth and lightheartedness, a stark contrast to what he left behind. Jessica joined them for the rest of the evening. As night fell, they sat on the grass watching fireworks. Darren couldn't help but notice how Tim and Elaine leaned into each other, their daughter asleep on their shared lap. A perfect picture of happiness. "Jealous?" Jessica asked softly. "Barry," Darren admitted. "Me too," she replied, her voice barely above a whisper. In the following days, Darren and Jessica didn't meet. Darren was busy finishing a song he had been working on, while Jessica focused on painting his car. She worked meticulously, layer by layer, until the car shone like new. Meanwhile, Darren and Melissa's relationship deteriorated further. They barely spoke. Helen urged Melissa to drop Danielle's toxic advice and talk to Darren honestly before it was too late. Melissa hesitated, torn between her need for control and her desire to repair things. One evening, Darren called Jessica. "Don't you want to finalize your divorce first?" she teased when he hinted at his plans. "Haha," he replied. "Darren has the papers ready. I just need to decide when to serve them." Jessica informed him the car was finished. "You'll need to add the grille and a few touches, but it's ready for its first drive." "Thanks, Jess. See you tonight," Darren said, feeling a rare spark of excitement. As Darren prepared to leave, Melissa walked into the room wearing a dress so short it left little to the imagination. "Don't wait up," she said curtly. "I'm heading out too," Darren replied. "And don't bring anyone here. Use a barrier or don't, not like it matters considering we haven't been intimate in ages." Without waiting for a response, he walked out, humming softly. Melissa, stunned, realized she had worn the dress hoping he'd ask her to stay. At Jessica's garage, she greeted Darren with a bright smile and dragged him to see his car. Covering his eyes playfully, she led him into the paint booth. Frustrated by their height difference, Darren scooped her up, laughing. "Are you nervous?" Jessica teased. "A little," Darren admitted. When Jessica finally let him see the car, Darren was awestruck. The bright yellow paint glowed under the lights, the white stripes gleaming against the base coat. "The stripes are painted, not decals," Jessica explained proudly. "They're seamless." Overcome with gratitude, Darren leaned in and kissed her. Jessica hesitated but quickly gave in, her passion surprising even herself. Between kisses, she murmured, "Helen is going to eliminate me." Jessica's hands brushed a lump in Darren's jacket pocket. Curious, she pulled out a small box. Inside was a ring, crafted from intricately folded paper. She laughed. "You scared me," she thought. "What would you say if it were real?" Darren asked seriously. "You'd have to propose to find out." Jessica teased. "It's not a ring." "It's a song for you," Darren said shyly. Jessica's expression softened. "Most guys say that to get me into bed," she joked, "but they never actually follow through." "This isn't about that," Darren said. "This song is for you." He picked up a guitar and began playing the opening chords. Jessica listened intently, humming along as she read the lyrics. By the time they finished, her expression was a mix of inspiration and trepidation. "This is incredible," she said softly, "but it's also terrifying." Later that evening, Jessica arranged a band rehearsal to try out Darren's song. Beforehand, Darren took her for a ride in his freshly painted convertible, the warm night air adding to the joy of the experience. For the first time in years, Darren felt completely at ease. When he returned home, Melissa was asleep on the couch, still in the short dress she had worn earlier. Darren noticed she wasn't wearing underwear, but he didn't linger. Quietly, he went upstairs, packed an overnight bag, and wrote the note he'd been composing in his mind for days. Leaving it beside her, he kissed her gently one last time before walking out. As he drove away, tears blurred his vision. Despite everything, a part of him still loved Melissa. But her threats of infidelity, now seemingly realized, had broken something inside him. Melissa stirred hours later, hazy from the drink she'd consumed. She vaguely recalled Darren kissing her and thought it was a dream. Too disoriented to think clearly, she fell back asleep. Darren checked into a motel, but struggled to sleep. His thoughts oscillated between the pain of leaving Melissa and the newfound connection he felt with Jessica. Her kiss had stirred emotions he hadn't felt in years. Still, unguarded passion. By morning, Darren knew he needed time. He called his secretary to request a few days off and asked Ryan to finalize the divorce papers. Ryan assured him they would be fair but firm, ensuring Darren's financial security while leaving Melissa with enough to rebuild her life. Melissa woke with a pounding headache and an inexplicable sadness. She blamed the drink but couldn't shake the deeper sense of loss. She realized she had pushed Darren away to protect herself from being hurt, but now she feared it was too late. Determined to make amends, Melissa decided to invite Darren to lunch and have an honest conversation. However, when she entered their bedroom, her resolve crumbled. His drawers were empty, his favorite suits gone, and his bathroom shelf cleared. Panic gripped her as the reality of his departure set in. She replayed the previous night. Darren had warned her not to bring anyone home, which had infuriated her. She started drinking despite him, but now she felt foolish. The idea of Darren believing she had betrayed him was absurd. She had only ever been with two men, her manipulative college boyfriend, Ryan, and Darren, her husband. The stories she had told Darren about other men were lies meant to keep him off balance. Her thoughts spiraled until she remembered Darren coming home. He had kissed her and cried. Had he believed she was unfaithful? Guilt tightened her chest. Her phone rang, jolting her from her thoughts. Helen's voice boomed on the other end, full of frustration. "Helen, stop yelling," Melissa groaned. "Just come over if you need to talk." When Helen arrived, she didn't mince words. "You look awful," she said bluntly. "Thanks for the vote of confidence," Melissa replied sarcastically. Helen crossed her arms. "You never listen to me, Melissa, but let me ask you, who are you going to find better than Darren?" Melissa stared at her in confusion. "What do you mean?" Helen sighed deeply. "I've seen this before. You're heading down the same path I did. I was wild when I was younger, and my husband, George, put up with a lot. But one night I got drunk and made a mistake. George couldn't handle it, and I almost lost everything." Melissa sat silently, Helen's words cutting deep. Her eyes widened as Helen shared her story, each detail sinking like a stone in her heart. A friend convinced George to sleep with someone else to even the score, Helen said, her voice trembling. "He did, with one of my friends. But it didn't help. George said it wasn't the same because I gave consent. He felt like he had no choice. We ended up in an open relationship. I hated it, but I thought it was my fault. George never wanted to betray me. He only agreed because he loved me. For 2 years we lived like that until he left me a note. It shattered me. I later learned he had lied. He'd never been with anyone else. He thought lying would help us heal." Helen's hands trembled as she gripped Melissa's. "We're still together, but it's not the same. Our love feels hollow. Every time he looks at me, I know he sees those other men. It's only a matter of time before he leaves me for good." Melissa's chest tightened as Helen's plea grew more desperate. "Melissa, real control in a marriage comes from giving it up. Darren loves you, but if you keep this up, you'll lose him. Look at Danielle, bitter, sleeping with random men while her ex has moved on. Or Sandra, dating anyone just to avoid being alone. Is that what you want? Melissa tried to push back. Helen, thank you for your advice, but Darren and I still have a chance. I'm going to his office today to have lunch and talk. Helen shook her head. That won't happen, she said bluntly. Remember my sister, the one who sang at the club? Melissa continued. She's gorgeous, naturally charming, and doesn't even realize the effect she has on men. And right now she's helping Darren move on. What are you talking about? Melissa demanded, panic rising. They're making memories together, Helen said. She painted his car, he wrote her a song, and they're spending time together. Meanwhile, Darren feels like you've been punishing him for years. He told Jess this morning he's leaving you and filing for divorce. He's devastated. Melissa felt the room spin. What should I do? She asked, her voice shaking. Don't let him leave, Helen urged. If he goes, Jess will likely go with him. Beg him to stay. Show him you're ready to change. Melissa read Darren's note while Helen bustled around, making phone calls and preparing a green smoothie. As she read, tears streamed down her face. Helen handed her the drink. What is this? Melissa asked. Just drink it, Helen said. It'll help with the hangover. Meanwhile, Darren sat with Jessica, rehearsing her band's rendition of his song. Watching her smile and hearing her voice gave him a sense of peace he hadn't felt in years. Her enthusiasm was genuine, her laughter unforced, and Darren found himself drawn to her light. Can we run the chorus again? Jessica asked. I want it to be perfect. Darren nodded, knowing he couldn't focus on work with the storm of emotions swirling inside him. Melissa's treatment of him had been the final straw in a marriage he had tried desperately to save. He had loved her through everything, hoping one day she would let go of her pain and love him back. But Melissa's behavior had only worsened over the years, especially after she started spending time with her manipulative friends. When she began openly threatening infidelity and then followed through, something in Darren broke. As Jessica sang, Darren realized he had made the right choice to step away. This moment, creating something meaningful with someone who respected and cared for him, was what he had been missing for so long. Darren's fingers danced lightly over the guitar strings, muting them to create the staccato rhythm that began the song. As Jessica sang, she approached him, her voice clear and captivating. Darren listened intently, knowing the words weren't hers. They were his. The song captured everything he wished he could say to Melissa, but he knew she'd never hear it. Last night's betrayal had extinguished any remaining hope for their marriage. This performance wasn't just the start of something new. It was a symbolic end to his past. Jessica had suggested a poetic way to mark this transition. Performed the song at the club where they first connected. Meanwhile, Helen had been frantically calling Jessica all day. Sitting in a waiting room, she tried again. Jessica finally answered. Hey Helen. Do you know where Darren is? Helen asked, her tone urgent. I'm not sure, but he's with you, isn't he? Jessica replied calmly. I could find him if it's important. Helen accused. You promised to wait. I'm not like Melissa, Jessica said. I don't go to clubs. Let strangers touch me, and then tell my partner I'm with someone else. Where is he? Helen pressed. Melissa needs to talk to him. I doubt he'll want to talk to her, Jessica said. But if she insists, her best chance is at the club tonight. Darren's performing the song he wrote for me. We'll be there, Helen said firmly. Jessica added cryptically, it'll be a special night, dress for it. Meanwhile, in Dr. Agatha Harkness's office, Melissa recounted her story through tears. Agatha, renowned for her ability to repair broken relationships, listened with growing disbelief. Melissa didn't see herself as the problem. She acknowledged treating Darren poorly but justified her behavior as self-defense against her college heartbreak. Melissa, Agatha said gently, was Darren the one who hurt you in college? No, it was Ryan, Melissa replied, her voice tense. And your behavior now, part of it is a defense mechanism, isn't it? To prevent that pain from happening again. Agatha pressed. I guess so, Melissa admitted. Is it also about revenge for your humiliation? Agatha asked. Maybe, Melissa said hesitantly. Agatha continued, probing Melissa's contradictions. Melissa admitted allowing strangers to touch her at clubs while bearing Darren from similar closeness. She insisted Darren loved her and had never mistreated her. Yet she had spent years punishing him for another man's betrayal. Melissa, Agatha said, her tone firm, you wanted a fairy tale life, and Darren tried to give it to you. But instead of appreciating him, you made him pay for Ryan's sins. Bad things happen to everyone, but maturity means moving on. Darren isn't perfect, but he gave you love, respect, and a life together. Instead of cherishing him, you've spent 10 years punishing him for something he didn't do. Melissa sat in stunned silence as Agatha's words sank in. For the first time, she began to see the damage she had caused. That evening, Darren prepared for his performance at the club. Playing the song felt bittersweet. It carried the weight of his pain, but also the promise of a fresh start. Jessica, by his side, exuded confidence and warmth, a sharp contrast to the emotional turbulence he'd endured for years. As Darren strummed the opening chords, Jessica's voice filled the room, her presence electrifying. In that moment, Darren felt the weight of his past lift slightly. This was his turning point, a moment where he could finally begin to let go of Melissa and the pain she had caused. Melissa arrived at the club with Helen, her emotions a storm of regret and desperation. Seeing Darren perform the song, a raw, heartfelt reflection of everything he'd endured, shook her to the core. She realized too late how much she had lost and how far Darren had already moved on. Melissa's jaw tightened as Helen's words settled over her like a weight. Agatha's earlier questions still echoed in her mind. Melissa had spent years pushing Darren away while justifying her actions as self-defense for her past. If you had met Darren first, would your life be perfect? Agatha had asked. Yes, Melissa had admitted through gritted teeth. So you're punishing your husband for another man's betrayal as well as for your own impatience, Agatha said. Strangers at clubs can touch you, but the man who loves you and stood by you for over a decade has to wait for your permission to show affection. Can you see how cruel that is? Melissa had dismissed the accusation. Darren and I have intimacy all the time, at least once a month. If I could just figure out what his problem is, we'd be fine. Agatha's response was sharp. But leave my office. Come back when you're ready to face reality. Frankly, I hope Darren does leave you. Maybe then you'll understand. Melissa stormed out, livid. Seeing Helen waiting, she spat out her frustration. That so-called doctor doesn't know what she's talking about. She actually thinks I'm the problem. Helen sighed. Melissa, do you remember what I said? You need to show Darren you care. Make him happy. He was always happy until recently. No, Melissa, Helen countered. I might have loved you, but he wasn't happy with how you treated him. Be honest. Why do you want Darren back? Melissa hesitated, her voice softening. I didn't realize how much I needed him until recently. A few weeks ago, he took me to visit Tim and Elaine Matthews. Seeing them together, the way they looked at each other like nothing else mattered, it made me feel empty. I heard Elaine tell Tim that Darren was nice, but that I was an idiot. She was right. Helen nodded. Darren used to look at you like that, but if you keep pushing him away, he'll stop. And my sister Jessica is already there to catch him. She's not waiting until your divorce is final to get close to him. Melissa's eyes widened. She won't. She will, Helen said flatly. Jessica is lively, but principled. She won't actively pursue him until you're done, but she won't wait long. Darren loves you, but she's making him feel something he hasn't felt in years. Appreciated. You have one chance to change this, or you'll lose him. Melissa's chest tightened as the reality of Helen's words hit her. That evening, Helen called Sandra and Danielle to join them at the club. Sandra revealed it would be her last night out. "You're letting some guy control you," Danielle scoffed. "Absolutely," Sandra replied. "He makes me feel amazing. If you weren't so bitter about your ex, you'd understand." Danielle snorted. "I'll always be in control." Sandra shook her head. "People won't keep you warm at night. They won't tell you they love you when you feel insecure. You'll grow old, angry, and alone. I'd rather build a life with someone who loves me." As they headed to the club, Melissa couldn't stop thinking about Darren. She didn't care about control anymore. All she wanted was him back, his warmth, his love, and the life they once shared. "Please don't let it be too late," Melissa whispered, tears streaming down her face. When they arrived at the club, they were met with an unexpected issue. The parking lot was closed despite visible empty spaces, and a line of people stretched nearly a block. "What's going on?" Danielle asked, puzzled. "I told you we should have come earlier," Helen muttered. "Tonight will be different," Jessie said. They parked nearby and approached the entrance, but the usual bouncer waved them toward the line. "We'll be waiting for hours," Sandra grumbled. Helen stepped aside to make a call. Moments later, she returned, smiling. "We're in, let's go." She handed her phone to the bouncer, who spoke briefly before waving them through. As they entered, the roar of engines filled the air. A convoy of yellow Mustangs pulled into the lot, led by a striking convertible. Melissa's heart sank as she saw Jessica's wild hair flowing in the wind, seated beside Darren. He parked, opened the door for Jessica, and escorted her through a side entrance without even glancing in Melissa's direction. Inside, the club was packed. Seeing no tables available, they spotted a man Danielle knew sitting alone and joined him. Danielle quickly left to dance with him, leaving Melissa unsettled. The man who had flirted with her last week approached, draping an arm around her. "Where were we?" he asked, grinning. "Get away from me," Melissa snapped. "I don't need my husband seeing this." The man shrugged and left. Helen sighed. "It's too late. Jessica saw him last week." Melissa's chest tightened as the weight of her actions hit her. She realized she'd never truly been in control. Darren had followed her lead out of love, not submission. Now he was choosing his own path, and she desperately wanted him back. But it was his choice, not hers. Determined, Melissa began searching for Darren. A crowd had gathered near the stage, where tables had been moved closer, taking up part of the dance floor. She approached but was stopped by two imposing bouncers. "No entry," one said firmly. Melissa scanned the crowd and locked eyes with Elaine, who waved her over. At Elaine's signal, the bouncer let Melissa through. "Thank you," Melissa said. "Where's your husband? It's odd seeing you alone." Elaine smiled. "He's backstage with Darren, calming his nerves." Darren's excited and nervous. It's a big night for him. "Why's that?" Melissa asked, her curiosity piqued. "Darren hasn't performed in public before, and tonight there are record label reps here. He's got a lot riding on this," Elaine explained. Melissa's face tightened. Elaine noticed and said, "Maybe you still have a chance. You're here, which means you care. That's something." Melissa nodded, her resolve strengthening. Returning to her friends, Melissa ignored Danielle's questions about the reserved section. Instead, she turned to Helen. "Darren's performing tonight," she said. Before Helen could reply, the host introduced the first singer, a man with greasy hair belting an off-key rendition of Crazy Train. The crowd jeered him off stage before he finished the first verse. "They're brutal tonight," Sandra observed. "Usually they're kinder to the first acts. Something's definitely different." Over the next hour, 8 singers performed. 2 were genuinely talented, earning applause while the rest received lukewarm reactions or outright scorn. The low point came when a nearly 50-year-old man wearing tight pants that revealed a padded area attempted "Darren, if you think I'm nice." The crowd barely tolerated him. Another near disaster occurred when a man singing "Ride the Wind" responded to boos by flipping off the audience and mooning them. A group of irritated patrons chased him into the parking lot, whether out of anger at his behavior, his singing, or the song choice. No one could tell. Then the atmosphere shifted. The stage was cleared, and a new group of musicians took over. These men looked sharp, focused, hunters ready to pounce. As they tuned their instruments, the club fell silent. The lights dimmed, then a single spotlight illuminated Darren, standing alone with his guitar. Melissa's jaw tightened as whistles erupted from women near the stage. Darren, she thought, realizing bitterly that she was no different from them. Darren smiled, a charming boyish grin, and began to play a soft, infectious tune. The faint thump of a bass drum kept time. Melissa smiled at him, but he didn't notice. Her annoyance grew as the whistling intensified. Then the music shifted dramatically. A heavy bass line roared in, and Darren's melody transformed into a powerful guitar riff. The crowd erupted in excitement. Jessica joined Darren on stage, her wild hair flowing as she smiled and danced. Her chemistry was electric, and Darren became more animated. The lyrics struck Melissa like a blow. They described a marriage filled with frustration and neglect. Darren's side of their story. As Jessica sang about being ignored, Melissa's heart sank. She realized how often she had dismissed Darren's feelings, leaving him unheard. By the bridge, the song's intensity had the entire club on its feet. The crowd, despite hearing it for the first time, was singing along to the chorus. Jessica stomped playfully, mimicking a tantrum, her smiles with Darren igniting Melissa's jealousy. The lyrics echoed Darren's bottled-up frustrations, and Melissa saw how much pressure he had endured before finally exploding. As Jessica began the second verse about dwindling patience, she descended into the audience, pointing directly at Melissa. The crowd parted as Jessica approached. Reaching Melissa, she handed her a folded set of papers and returned to the stage just in time for the chorus. The packed club sang along, turning Darren's marital grievances into an anthem. Melissa clutched the papers, assuming they were lyrics. The energy in the room was surreal, hundreds of people celebrating a song about her failed marriage. Strangers around her reached for the papers, treating them like prized souvenirs. As the song ended, Jessica's voice boomed through the speakers. "Melissa Thomas," she said. Melissa froze, her name ringing in her ears. "You've been served," Jessica announced, the words reverberating through the room. The crowd erupted into cheers as Jessica and the band left the stage. Melissa unfolded the papers to confirm her dread. They were divorce papers. Around her, people celebrated Jessica's performance, declaring her their new favorite singer. Meanwhile, women Melissa recognized from the club, notorious for their bold advances, headed backstage, likely aiming for Darren. Melissa stood in shock, clutching the papers as the weight of everything came crashing down. Darren hadn't just written her a song. He had made their end a spectacle. Melissa stood frozen, clutching the divorce papers Jessica had handed her. Tears streamed down her face as Helen's warnings replayed in her mind. "Darren, she won't start until you have the divorce papers in hand. She's younger, prettier, and ready to settle down and have kids." Darren. Melissa had dismissed Helen's words at the time, but now they hit her like a punch to the gut. "Darren, not with my husband," Melissa had shouted defiantly then. Now the reality was sinking in. She and Helen hurried out of the club, leaving Sandra and Danielle behind. As they reached the parking lot, they saw a convoy of yellow Mustangs driving away. Melissa knew where they were headed and didn't rush. The drive to Tim and Elaine's house was silent. Melissa's mind churning, she couldn't shake the fear that Darren was slipping away for good. When they arrived, the house was surrounded by Mustangs and a crowd of people enjoying games and laughter. Despite the festive atmosphere, Melissa's anger boiled over. How could they all be having fun while her marriage falls apart? Spotting Elaine, she demanded to know where Darren was. Darren and Jessica stayed back at the club. Elaine said casually, "The band got a record deal, and they're negotiating contracts." "Did you notice Darren's Mustang isn't here?" Melissa's stomach twisted as Elaine's words sank in. Without another word, she grabbed Helen and drove back to the club. The parking lot was nearly empty, save for a yellow Mustang convertible and a couple of limousines. Melissa knocked at the door, and the bouncer who had let her in earlier greeted her with a smirk. "You're persistent," he said, opening the door. Inside, Melissa spotted Darren and Jessica seated together at a table. She stormed up to them. "Come on, Darren," she said sharply. "Let's go home. We need to talk." Jessica hummed a few lines of the song softly, her voice dripping with irony. "Darren," she said, "you already have the divorce papers. The ones tonight were symbolic, but the real ones will arrive tomorrow. This is the best decision for both of us. I've been your lackey for too long. So you're just running off with your little friend to play rock star and forget about us. You're just so caught up." Darren shook his head. "I have a career I love. Jess does too. Neither of us wants to be rock stars, but we do want more of each other. Once the divorce is finalized, we'll try to build something real. I suggest you get a lawyer." With that, Darren took Jessica's hand and walked out, leaving Melissa alone with her fury. In the days that followed, Melissa found a lawyer. At first, he dismissed Darren's claims of psychological misuse. Infidelity would have been easier to argue, he said, but after their first meeting with Darren's lawyer, his tone changed. "They have video evidence of you at clubs behaving in ways no married woman should," he told her bluntly. "The footage from your home is worse. Proof of you yelling, swearing, and humiliating him. Even your therapist's records don't help you. If this goes to court, you'll come off poorly. Settle and move on." The divorce proceeded quickly since there were no children and Darren wasn't contesting her share of the property. 3 months later, Darren proposed to Jessica, and she accepted. Darren bought out Melissa's share of the house, giving her enough to live on temporarily. Melissa spiraled into despair. Everywhere she went, she heard the song, on the radio, in stores, even on TV. The band had replaced Darren and Jessica with new members, but the original recording, featuring their performance, was a massive hit. The accompanying music video prominently featured Darren's Mustang and Jessica's magnetic presence. Despite their brief fame, Darren and Jessica returned to quiet lives. Jessica moved into the house that once belonged to Melissa and Darren. Melissa, meanwhile, moved in with Danielle, but the arrangement quickly soured. They clashed constantly, their shared bitterness only fueling the tension. Melissa blamed Danielle for ruining her marriage, accusing her of planting the seeds of manipulation and control that drove Darren away. As summer wore on, Melissa was haunted by the song and the life she had thrown away. Every lyric reminded her of Darren's pain and the choices that cost her the man who once loved her deeply. 2 years later, Jessica and Darren welcomed the first of their 3 children. Their life was filled with love and tranquility as they built the family Darren had always longed for. Melissa's life took a starkly different path. Struggling with the aftermath of her divorce, she began to gain weight, and as her settlement money dwindled, she took a job as a waitress to stay afloat. Then she found herself riding the bus back to her old neighborhood, where she would sit quietly, watching Darren and Jessica playing with their children in the yard. Each visit left her in tears, yet she couldn't stop. Some part of her clung to the futile hope that she could somehow reclaim the life she had lost, even as she knew, deep down, it was gone forever. The sight of Darren's happiness, once hers to nurture, now felt like a punishment she couldn't escape. Then there was the song, the one that became a constant reminder of her downfall. Whether it played in the restaurant, blared from a car stereo, or drifted over store speakers, it sent a chill through her. That song, capturing her failure and Darren's liberation, became the soundtrack of her regret, a haunting presence that she knew would stay with her for the rest of her life. Thanks to everyone who took the time to listen to today's stories. If you enjoyed it, please consider liking and subscribing if you haven't already. Feel free to share your thoughts on the events in the comments below. Take care.